Hello. Today, let me tell you a small fairy tale about cluster development. Let's call this fairy tale Cluster Medical Valley Hechingen. Everything began in a very small, sleepy, old-fashioned village which was well known for a huge castle. This castle you could see everywhere, from everywhere. The location is not so important, it's just in the middle of nowhere of Germany. That is how the story began. There was an old cluster coming back from the Middle Age, well known for watchmaking, clockmaking. It was an old cluster, well established, and it lasted for many years. Everyone was happy, everyone was rich, so it was a good old time. But something happened. Asian and Japanese watchmaker came with digital watches, with new kind of watches. And everyone started to buy these fancy watches, so that the old cluster in Hechingen, our beautiful village, started dying. And all the tragedy began. But there was a slight hope when around 1970 a big company called Gambro came around the corner and settled down the cluster. Why they did? For watchmaking you need competence, mechanical competence, engineering, very, very tiny stuff. And this company was exactly looking for such competences. Since the old cluster was dying, many people were unemployed. And Gambro was very happy to employ these people. And after this big company settled down in the village of Hechingen, more and more company came also from the field of medical devices. So we could see that from a watchmaking cluster, something happened and transformed into a model medical device cluster. What we could see is that an old, dying watch cluster disappeared and the competence of the people, of the employees, were taken into the new cluster, into the medical device cluster. And over time, more and more cluster and companies settled down. The next fairy tale began. So we have research institutions, big companies settled down, but small ones as well, education, universities, and everything what we need as an ingredient for good cluster development. And finally, a good, strong cluster management, which pulled all of them together, so the fairy tale began again. Unfortunately, even our fairy tales doesn't last forever. Something happened, and the next catastrophe began. The cluster management changed, the old cluster manager went away, the new came, but the quality of the cluster management, of coordinating, was not as good as before. And this had a very negative impact on the companies, because they were a bit spoiled. They were in a cluster with a very good cluster manager, and now the new one didn't perform. So everything slowed down, everyone became unhappy, everyone became dissatisfied. So the cluster slowly started dying. People moved out, companies moved out, the cluster shrunk, and in the end it was very doubtful that this cluster can survive under these circumstances. So the cluster was slowly dying. What was even more a catastrophe, in the neighbor village, another cluster, similar cluster, settled down. So there was competition around the corner. So everyone was unhappy, everyone was desperate, and the key question for our case study is now how to succeed to turn a dying cluster around. But that is, I will tell you after a longer break, because now it's up to you to discover what could be the option, the strategies to turn this cluster from a dying cluster in a lively cluster again. So give me a couple of minutes, then I will tell you the solution.